verses where it's kind of tedious, and we'll start to level out. So the prophecies they start to get a lot more specific. Kind of the main villain of the chapter, which is Antiochus IV. But it also leads up to kind of letting the people know what to expect leading up to the time of the Messiah. And so that's, if you kind of keep that in mind, that's really the point, is that when, Daniel's giving them this vision, recording this vision, so that they'll have this to read. So when they start seeing these things happen, they'll realize that the time of the Messiah is getting close. And if you kind of keep that in mind, all the in-depth details, you don't have to really remember all that stuff real precisely. But anyway, because I know most of us won't remember this anyway. All right, so we'll start with verse 20. So if you remember from last week, what's happening is basically Christ is giving Daniel a vision. It lasts several chapters. And what's happening in chapter 11 is he is talking about different rulers from two different parts of the Greek Empire that broke up after Alexander the Great died. So after he died, the kingdom was split into four parts, but he's only dealing with two of the 4 parts. And the 2 parts are the area that we would call Mesopotamia, that includes Syria and Palestine, Israel, that area. And that's ruled by the Seleucids, which is named after Seleucus, who was one of the generals after Alexander the Great that took over that part. The other part is Egypt, which is ruled by the Ptolemies, which is named after Ptolemy, who was the general that took over that part. So basically you have a north and a south. North refers to Israel, Syria, Mesopotamia. South refers to Egypt. And he just keeps going back and forth talking about this ruler is going to do this and that ruler is going to do that. And so it's very specific prophecies about all these different rulers, and they're all descendants of each other. That happens over a period of time. So now we're sort of winding down to the end, and we're about to get to Antiochus IV, who's really the main villain, human villain of the chapter. And so we'll start with verse 20 again. And kind of like last week, I'll read you a little bit of the history, and then we'll look at the verses, and you can kind of see how it applies. All right, so we'll start with verse 20. So Antiochus III, who is obviously Antiochus IV's father, Antiochus III was a great conqueror. He's sort of like a miniature version of Alexander the Great. And so he is going to be in the north, one of the Seleucid descendants. So after he dies, his son Seleucus IV takes the throne, and he'll reign from 187 to 175. But if you remember from last week, Antiochus III kind of overstepped his bounds, ended up losing his kingdom status, and became a vassal of the Greek Empire. And so he has to start paying tribute to Greece, the Greek Empire. And so as a result, then his son also has to do the same. And so for them to be able to raise the money for that, they have to go collect money from their territory to do so. So in order for Seleucus IV to pay his tribute, he sends his finance minister, a guy named Heliodorus, to Jerusalem to raid the temple treasury. It doesn't work out, and long story short, Heliodorus ends up poisoning Seleucus IV, and he dies, okay? In the meantime, Antiochus IV was a prisoner in Rome. So I said Grecian Empire a minute ago. It's kind of Greco-Roman Empire. He was a prisoner, but he's now being released. And so as his brother is dying, he's actually being released and let go back to the Syria area. Okay, so Antiochus IV was a prisoner of Rome after the treaty that his father signed. However, in late 176 or early 175, he was released in exchange for his nephew. So they had to give up his nephew for him to get released, and that nephew's name is Demetrius. That's Seleucus IV's oldest son. So he was in Athens when his brother Seleucus IV dies, and what ends up happening is Antiochus IV kind of gathers an army together, and he's going to go back home basically to try to take the throne by force, even though his nephew really was the rightful heir. So when he gets back, he does takes the throne, but he's going to rule as a co-regent with an infant nephew of his, a kid also named Antiochus. But that infant nephew is going to get murdered in 170 BC, which leaves Antiochus IV to be the ruler basically by deceit. He never should have been the ruler. He wasn't in the line. He's the brother or the uncle of the rightful ruler, but he's not the one that should have been ruling. So he gets it through some unscrupulous ways. And so with that in mind, let's read some of the verses, and some of this maybe will make a little bit of sense. So verse 20, it says, "Then shall arise in his place one, who is Seleucus IV, who shall send an exactor," that's the Heliodorus guy, "of tribute for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken," meaning Seleucus IV, "neither in anger nor in battle." So in other words, Seleucus IV will die, but not by somebody physically harming him or in a battle. So in other words, nobody's going to stab him or anything. He's actually going to be poisoned. So that's what that's talking about. All right, so verse 21, "In his place shall arise a contemptible person," and that's Antiochus IV, which is his brother, "to whom royal majesty has not been given," meaning he really wasn't the rightful heir, but he kind of took it. And it says, "He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries." And the flatteries there again is referring to how he got control. He really should never have been the one in control. All right, so it says, "Armies shall utterly sweep away before him and be broken," probably referring to some of his military action to take over. And then it says, "Even the prince of the covenant." So what is happening is when he takes control, the high priest in Jerusalem at that time is a dude named Onias III, and he was opposed to Hellenism taking hold in Jerusalem and Israel. So he was against the Greek Roman culture coming in. And under Seleucus IV, he was allowed to basically be in charge of Jerusalem, and he could kind of keep the Hellenism at bay. And he was allowed to basically be a high priest in the way that you think of high priests in the Old Testament should be operating. But when Antiochus IV takes over, the high priest's brother actually is in favor of Hellenism and the Greek culture and all that stuff, and his name is Jason. And Jason ends up bribing Antiochus IV to be made the high priest instead. So Antiochus IV accepts the bribe, makes Jason the high priest, and his brother, who was the high priest, has to flee. He eventually gets murdered, and so forth. But over time, what is going to happen is this other guy steps in and offers Antiochus IV an even bigger bribe to become high priest. And that guy isn't actually in the rightful line to be a high priest at all. And so what starts to happen is you start to have this situation where Rome starts to decide who is the high priest. It has nothing to do with who's in the correct lineage to be a high priest. They don't come from high priestly families. It's just a matter of who wants to offer the biggest bribe to get the job. And so with all that in mind, Hellenism starts creeping in to Jerusalem and so forth. And so that's what it's referring to in verse 22 when it says, even the prince of the covenant. All right, verse 23, it says, and from the time that an alliance is made with him, meaning the new high priest with Antiochus, he shall act deceitfully and he shall become strong with a small people. So in other words, he will have Jewish supporters. Even though he is an oppressor, he is not a good person. There are some Jews that will support him because they like seeing this idea. They like the Greek culture. They want to see the Greek culture come in and take over Jerusalem and basically do away with the Jewish culture. All right, so it says, without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. So in other words, he's going to come in, and he's going to raid the temples throughout his territory to collect money so that he can pay the vassal tax. But he's going to do it at a greater extent than even his fathers before him did. So he's not going to have a good reputation. People aren't going to like him, generally speaking. All right, now let me read you a bit about what's going to happen here in verses 25 through 28. So initially, Antiochus IV, when he takes over in his territory, his sister Cleopatra was acting as regent in Egypt. Now, if you remember this from last week, Antiochus IV's father, he wanted to gain control of Egypt. Remember, they're in the north, Egypt's in the south. And he couldn't take them by military force because Rome was starting to creep in and starting to support Egypt. So he knew he couldn't take it by force. So his big plan was, well, let me marry my daughter to the king down there, and she'll undermine them, and that way I'll get control of the south through my daughter. And her name is Cleopatra. However, she ends up siding with her husband instead of her father, so his little plan didn't work out. So now you fast forward to Antiochus IV is ruling in the north, and Cleopatra, who is his sister, is ruling in the south. Okay, so convoluted family situation, but you got an evil brother in the north and a sister in the south, and that's who's ruling at this point. All right, so she's going to be acting as a regent in the south. Presumably her husband has died at this point. And she's ruling because her son, who is Ptolemy VI, so we're down to the sixth one of these guys, he's too young to rule at this point. But once she does finally die and Ptolemy VI is now the ruler, he gets bad advice from some of his counselors, and they tell him to go invade Palestine and try to take that area back from his uncle, who is the bad guy, Antiochus IV. All right, so Antiochus IV, however, somehow he becomes aware of this plot, and he ends up attacking his nephew kind of by surprise and ends up defeating him. And kind of a long story short happens at this point. So at this point, again, Antiochus knows he can't get control of Egypt because Rome is sort of involved at this point. So what he does is he basically conquers all of Egypt except Alexandria, but he puts his nephew, the one that attacked him, he puts him on the throne, but thinks that he'll basically be a vassal to him. So Ptolemy VI is ruling most of Egypt, but in Alexandria, they put his brother on the throne there, and his brother's name is Ptolemy VII. So you got a 6 and a 7, but they're brothers. And so you effectively have 2 kings in Egypt at this point, one in the south and one in the north. All right, so over time, their sister, who's also named Cleopatra, it starts getting really confusing, right? Her name is Cleopatra II. She ends up getting the 2 brothers to work it out, so now all of Egypt is happy again. The Ptolemies are ruling Egypt. And Antiochus IV is up in the north, and he's upset because his little plan didn't work. And that's kind of the gist of a lot of that. All right, so let's look at 25 through 28 with some of that in mind. All right, he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. That's where he goes and attacks Egypt. And the king of the south, which is his nephew, Ptolemy VI, shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand. In other words, Antiochus IV wins. For plot shall be devised against him. In other words, Antiochus IV found out about the plot before it all happened. 26, even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. In other words, the Egyptian side of it fails. Verse 27, and as for the 2 kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table. So that's talking about the alliance between Antiochus IV and his nephew, Ptolemy VI. So they thought they had an alliance, but it was built on lies. They both lied to each other. And so the alliance was never going to work because they thought they were just tricking each other and they were just lying to each other. All right, so it says, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the appointed time. And so that last little phrase is a little break in the conversation here where Christ is telling Daniel this prophecy, but he pauses here for a second and he says, the reason this stuff isn't happening the reason this stuff continues to happen is because the end has not yet occurred. In other words, God is in control of all this. There's a reason for all this. You just have to trust God that this is all going to work out. So it's a little break in the conversation there where Christ pauses to kind of give him some reassurance about what's going on. All right, verse 28, and he shall return to his land, meaning Antiochus IV will go back home to the north with greater wealth. And the reason he goes back home with greater wealth is because basically on the way home he's pouting because the things in Egypt didn't work out the way he wanted. So he just makes a pit stop in Jerusalem and raids the temple there on the way back home. And so he picks up a bunch of wealth in Jerusalem on his way back to his capital, which is Antioch. All right, so but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. All right, now let's talk about verse 29 and the first half of verse 30. So Antiochus IV decided to invade Egypt again in 168 BC, so he keeps having this idea as he wants to take over Egypt. But this was unsuccessful due to a fleet of Roman ships being present there. And that starts to hint at the coming of the 4th kingdom. Remember, we got 4 kingdoms. We're down to the kingdom 3 right now, which is the Greek kingdom, but the 4th kingdom is on its way in at this point. And what happens is there's a Roman leader there in Alexandria. His name is Gaius Popilius Elanius. Egypt had requested Roman help, so he comes, he brings a fleet of ships. And so with him was orders from the Senate that Antiochus IV was not to attack Egypt and he was to stop the war. And so what happens is the Roman leader greets Antiochus IV when he gets there, and he tells him the Senate has said that you're not to attack and you're supposed to stop. And Antiochus IV says, well, let me talk to my friends about what I should do. And this is where this famous idea comes. The Roman commander takes a stick and draws a circle around him in the dirt. And he says, you better make your decision before you step out of the circle. And so basically, you need to decide right now, you're not consulting anybody. And so Antiochus gives up and he says, okay, I will stop and I'll go back home. Obviously, he's very humiliated by this. So he agrees to stop. He withdraws his forces. So if you look at 29 and 30, now maybe that'll make a little sense. So at the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south. In other words, he's going to try to attack Egypt again, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim, and that's referring to Rome, and that's a reference to something from Numbers that we don't have time to talk about, shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. All right, we'll just keep going here. He shall take back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. What this is, let me read the next verse, and I'll tell you what all that's about. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. All right, so what happens is in 167 BC, Antiochus IV sends a collector of revenue to Jerusalem, and in the process he tricks the Jews there, making them think that he's going to support them, but he doesn't really. And then what ends up happening is he's going to suppress the Jews and forbid them from any kind of religious practice. They can't possess a copy of the scriptures. They can't offer sacrifices. They can't do circumcision. They can't follow festival days. If they do any of those things, they'll suffer the death penalty. And so he also erects on the temple altar on December 6th, 167 BC, an idol probably of Zeus. And then 10 days later, on December 16th of 167, he offers his sacrifices on the idol, on the altar in the temple, and it probably included pigs. And you can read about that stuff in the Maccabees letters. The high priest at the time, which is the dude that offered the biggest bribe, and his followers gave in to the forced Hellenization, but many other Jews resisted. And then there's a priest, not the high priest, but actually a faithful priest, a guy named Mattathias, and his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. They lead a revolt, and the revolt is named after one of the sons. So the revolt is called the Judas Maccabeus, or the Maccabean Revolt. That's where the Maccabean, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Maccabees comes from. So they lead a revolt, and they're actually able to push Antiochus IV and those people out, and they recapture Jerusalem and reinstitute Jewish worship in Jerusalem. So that's what those 2 verses are about. Okay, so verse 33, it says, "And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder." And so when the word stumble there, what it's referring to is there will be persecution for the faithful during this time. Some of them will die as a result of the persecution. Verse 34, "When they stumble, they shall receive a little help." And the little help means that other humans will offer them some help. Help of a human is little by comparison to the help that God can provide. But some humans will offer them a little help. And it says, "And many shall join themselves to them with flattery." And that's a warning to not trust everybody that offers you help, because some of them are deceiving you, and they're really tricking you to make you fall. All right, so with that, let me read 35. "And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for all still awaits the appointed time." So what that latter part is talking about the faithful people of God. The reason that they're allowed to suffer this persecution is that it will refine them, purify them, and make them white. In other words, it's going to make them stronger. So why is God allowing all this to happen? Well, it's to get a very strong and faithful group of Jews who will be ready for the Messiah to come. Now, I'll tell you what kind of develops out of this are the Pharisees, out of this persecution at this time. The Pharisees started off as a good thing. By the time Jesus comes, they've kind of gone a little further than they should have with their beliefs. But they initially started off good, and so this is part of what comes out of this situation in the 160s BC time frame. All right, now we're going to go in a totally different direction with the rest of the chapter, and pretty much all scholars agree that the rest of the chapter is different than the first. And we're going to talk about another individual. There's two options for who this individual is. Some will argue that it is Antiochus IV for the rest of the chapter, but the problem with arguing for that is a lot of the things that are said here about this individual don't match up with anything about Antiochus. In fact, it's the exact opposite of some of the stuff that he did. And then there's some other more grammatical things that would probably bore you as to why that may not be the best choice. The other option is, and the more popular option throughout all of Christendom, is that this is the same individual that we looked at in chapter 7 when we talked about the little horn. It's the same individual that Paul talks about in the Thessalonian letter, and also the same individual that you see in the book of Revelation, which has some different names, but generally probably the name you're most familiar with is the Antichrist, okay? And so that's the more popular take on who this person is that we're going to read about throughout the rest of the chapter. All right, so verse 36, it says, "And the king," and so that's one little thing to trigger you that this is different. So we just talked about 20 different kings from the Seleucid group, the Ptolemy group. None of them are ever referred to as the king, okay? So this seems to be a different person or individual or whatever because of the way he's introduced. So he's called the king. He shall do as he wills. Now, I guess I'll tell you this up front, and I'm a little uncomfortable saying this, so I'm not telling you to believe this. One popular opinion on who the Antichrist is, and I'm not telling you to believe this, but as we read it, you can think about it, and you can at least see where people might come to this conclusion. One popular opinion is that it's the papacy, okay? So the Roman Catholic Pope. Take it as you wish, okay? If you think it fits, whatever. All right, maybe not. All right, so anyway, here we go. "And the king shall do as he wills." In other words, he does whatever he wants. "He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god." So in other words, he puts himself above all the gods. And that's something Antiochus IV did not do. He did call himself a god, or he called himself Epiphanes, but he still promoted the worship of the Greek gods. So he didn't eliminate them. He just kind of put himself on par with them. So that doesn't really fit him. But whoever this person is basically puts themselves above the gods. "He shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods." And by astonishing things, what it means is he will say things that are basically directly contradictory to God's word or to the gospel message. And so he'll say things, and the same thing was said about the little horn back in chapter 7. So he'll say things that sound good and maybe even sound slightly right. But the idea is to take people away from the true gospel message and pervert it and lead them astray into a different message that sounds sort of similar but is false, okay? So it says, "He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done." In other words, this guy or series of guys or whatever, it's going to last till Christ returns, okay? So he's going to cause chaos for the church throughout the entire church age is what that means, okay? All right, verse 37, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, which suggests that he does come out of what? He comes out of the church originally, okay? So his fathers were part of the church. He came up in that environment, but he steps out of that environment to do his own thing, okay? So it says, or to the one beloved by women. You might find a slightly different translation for that. Most people think that is a reference to instituting celibacy. So in other words, the first part of the verse says that he doesn't really have any honor or respect for God. The second part, he doesn't have any respect or honor for marriage, okay? And so he's going to impose that on other people as well. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. So in other words, he doesn't honor any of the gods, but what is his God? Well, his God is the God of fortresses, which is another way to say that his God is power, okay? He likes power. So it says, a God whom his fathers did not know. So in other words, if his fathers were part of the church, power was not what they were seeking. They were seeking to serve the Lord and God the Father. That's not his motivation, okay? It says, a God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. In other words, power is his main goal, and he'll do so with money, if he needs to. Verse 39, he shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. In other words, the foreign god, again, is power. And then it goes on in the latter part of the verse. Those who acknowledge him he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. In other words, his supporters he will promote, he will elevate them, and he will give them monetary support to do what he wants them to do, okay? All right, verse 40, at the time of the end, and that's when Christ is going to return. So the end of all time, when Christ comes back. And this is where, okay, I should tell you this part up front. The rest of this chapter, 40 through 45, are things that haven't yet happened, okay? So I don't know what they mean, just to be honest with you. Nobody does, because they're prophecies that haven't yet actually come true or haven't been fulfilled, all right? So I can't, you could speculate on what some of this is. I honestly don't know. So we're going to read it pretty quick because I don't have a whole lot to say. But I will tell you a couple things. Since we're in the Christian era at this point, we're referring to the fourth kingdom at this point, which is the Roman kingdom. And a few of the things mentioned here are metaphorical because they don't exist by the time you hit the fourth kingdom. There is no longer a king of the south and a king in the north by the time the Roman kingdom comes into fruition. When Rome took over, they destroyed that whole Seleucids in the north, Ptolemies in the south thing, got rid of it. So even though it's going to talk about the king of the north and the king of the south, there is no such thing by the time you hit the fourth kingdom. The other thing is he's going to talk about Moab, Ammon, and Edom. Even during Daniel's time, Moab didn't exist anymore, okay? So we'll have to talk about what that is. But by the time you hit the Roman times, Moab wasn't a thing. And so a lot of this becomes very figurative. And again, what does it all mean? I'm not quite sure that I can tell you the answer to all of this. All right. So we'll just with that in mind, we'll kind of go through it rather quickly. It says, at the time of the end, meaning when Christ returns, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and with mighty ships, and he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. What that may just be alluding to is the fact that what is happening is Antiochus IV, who was the king of the north, he was a precursor to this king. In other words, some of the stuff he did, the Antichrist is going to do, but on a much greater scale. than he did. And so what's happening is the Antichrist is taking the position of the king of the north, even though there isn't physically such a thing anymore, but he's kind of taking that role. So when it talks about the king of the north, it's not a literal thing. It's just referring to the Antichrist. And so what it's saying is if anyone attacks him, he's going to attack back. He doesn't feel responsible to anyone. He does whatever he wants to do. He doesn't answer to anybody. He doesn't even answer to God. Okay, so he does whatever he wants. And that may be what this is referencing, that if he's attacked, he's just going to attack back. Verse 41, he shall come into the glorious land. The glorious land here is talking about not Palestine specifically like it was earlier, but now it's talking about the church. Okay, he shall come into the church, if you want to call it that, and tens of thousands shall fall. In other words, he's going to lead a bunch of people astray with what he does. But these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. And so these countries don't really exist at this point. So what are they? They represent God's enemies, is what they're representing. Okay. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. I don't quite know what that means. He shall become ruler of the treasuries of gold and silver and the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. I don't know what that means either. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him. Okay, so what do we know so far based on what we've read? Okay, all we can really say is he's going to engage in some kind of power struggle with those who try to overcome him, and he's going to, it seems like, but what it's describing here is he's right on the verge of some major victory, okay? The details, I don't know, but it just sounds like he's right on the verge of winning some major victory against his enemies. The power struggle will affect God's people, causing persecution and martyrdom. But then when you get to verse 44, it says, but news from the east and the north shall alarm him. So something is going to happen which is going to cause him to persecute many and strengthen his position as a religious figure among God's people. So something's going to trigger him where he's basically going to up his persecution and all of the activities that he's doing. But what's going to happen in the end is his final act will not save him, since no one can stand against God's judgment. So when you look at the end of verse 44, it says, he shall go out with a great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. This is another euphemism for the church. Okay, so he's going to pitch his tent against the church. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Okay. In other words, eventually God's going to put a stop to it all, okay? All right, so let me give you a couple reasons why some people argue this is the papacy. I'm not telling you to believe that. I'm just telling you it's a very popular, long-standing, and by long-standing I mean thousands of years long-standing belief of some people in the church that this is referring to the papacy, all right? So here are some reasons for it. I'm not telling you that it's definitely true. All right, so here we go. The Antichrist promotes false doctrine that conflicts with the gospel of Christ, especially the central role of faith in salvation. So that when he's talking about, he's going to say, what was the phrase? Astonishing things is the way the ESV says it. That's what that's alluding to. All right. He institutes forms of worship that conflict with the gospel. He rules in the church. He assumes the right to forgive or retain sins in this life, and even claims jurisdiction over the fate of souls after this life. He is a ruler in the church, but claims temporal power as well. In other words, not only is his power in the church, but he tries to exact his power on countries and world leaders and other things, okay? So power is his main goal, both in the church and outside the church. The fourth one, he makes himself out to be God by usurping the authority and prerogatives of God himself. In other words, he does what he wants regardless of what God and God's word says, which we've seen a fair bit of that in the last period of years. He is unwilling to be judged by the church, so he's basically no one holds him accountable or anyone else, and fiercely persecutes any who dissent against him. So those are 4 traditional claims why this might refer to the papacy, right? I think we'll stop there tonight because the first bell rang. The last chapter will go pretty quick. It's pretty short, but we won't have time to finish it tonight. So we definitely should be able to finish it next time. But we'll stop for now, unless anybody has any comments or questions. John, I figured. Anybody else? John, go ahead. Yeah. Okay. So if you didn't hear John basically believes the Pope is who this is talking about. That's the short version. And he read from 2 Thessalonians where Paul talks about the son of perdition. The son of perdition and the person here are generally considered the same individual, as well as the Antichrist in Revelation. All 3 of those passages are considered to be talking about the same person. Steve. Mm-hmm.
The Catholic Church and the Roman Empire were basically one. That's, until the Roman Empire fell.
Yeah.
Force, power, fortress. So that
yeah, if I don't bring it up in chapter 12, remind me, Steve. I was going to say something briefly about that. But you're correct. There was somebody else over here. I couldn't see who it was. Go ahead. Okay. Well, that's pretty condemning. Thank you. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Okay. I will not be able to teach next week. I think I know what's going to happen, but I'm not going to say it in case I'm wrong. Someone else will teach next week, and then I'll come back and finish up Daniel the following week. But anyway, good to see everybody. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I thought. So Steve's going to teach Haggai next week. I didn't want to put you on the spot in case something changed. Steve's going to start or teach Haggai next week, and then I'll come back the next week and do chapter 12. All right. Good to see everybody. Have a good week.